Picture this. October 1907. Lines stretch for blocks outside banks across New York City. Depositors desperate to withdraw their savings before it's too late. The stock market has collapsed 50% from its peak. Trust companies are failing. Banks are running out of cash. The entire American financial system is hours away from total collapse. And the only thing standing between the United States and economic catastrophe is one man, not the president, not the Treasury, not Congress. A 70-year-old private banker named J.P. Morgan, who has locked every major financier in New York inside his private library and refuses to let them leave until they save the system. Welcome to the Ledger Chronicle, where the vault of history unlocks the secrets of money and power. This is the story of the Panic of 1907, the crisis that proved America needed a central bank, and the secret meeting 3 years later on a private island where 6 men wrote the blueprint for the Federal Reserve in absolute secrecy, denying it happened for 2 decades. To understand the panic, you need to understand what America lacked. By 1907, the United States was an industrial giant. It had the world's largest economy, massive corporations, booming cities, railroads spanning the continent. But it had no central bank, no lender of last resort, no institution that could inject liquidity into the system during a crisis. The country had tried central banking twice before, the first and second banks of the United States. Both were killed by populist political opposition, most famously Andrew Jackson's war against the second bank in the 1830s. Americans, especially in rural areas, distrusted concentrated financial power. They feared a central bank would favor Eastern elites over farmers and small businesses. So for over 70 years, America operated without one. When banks needed emergency funds, they turned to private institutions like the New York Clearing House. And when that wasn't enough, they turned to wealthy individuals. This system worked until it didn't. The immediate trigger for the panic was a failed speculation. 2 speculators, F. Augustus Heinze and Charles Morse, attempted to corner the market on United Copper Company stock. They believed they could buy up enough shares to force short sellers to pay inflated prices. The scheme collapsed. The price of United Copper plummeted. Banks that had lent money to Heinze and Morse faced massive losses. Runs began on these banks. Depositors, fearing their money was at risk, lined up to withdraw everything. The runs spread, not just to banks directly involved with Heinze and Morse, but to any institution that seemed remotely connected. Panic is contagious. Once it starts, rationality disappears. On October 21st, the crisis reached a tipping point. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the second largest trust in New York, faced a massive run. Trust companies were financial institutions that competed with banks for deposits, but operated with less regulation and lower reserve requirements. They were riskier, and in a panic, they were the first to fall. The National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for Knickerbocker. That was a death sentence. The run intensified. Within hours, Knickerbocker's president was forced to resign. The next day, the company suspended operations. It had failed. And with Knickerbocker's collapse, the panic became systemic. If one of New York's largest trusts could fall, any institution could fall. The runs spread to healthy banks. The stock market plunged. Credit froze. By late October, the United States was in full financial meltdown. When the panic began, J.P. Morgan was in Virginia attending a church convention. He was 70 years old, semi-retired, and arguably the most powerful private financier in the world. He had already saved the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1893 by organizing a gold loan that kept the country on the gold standard. Now, once again, the nation turned to him. Morgan returned to New York on October 19th and immediately set up command in the library of his Madison Avenue mansion. He assembled a team of the city's top bankers. Benjamin Strong, vice president of Bankers Trust, examined the books of failing institutions. Morgan and his associates decided which were solvent and which were beyond saving. Knickerbocker Trust was deemed insolvent. Morgan let it fail. That decision shocked the market, but Morgan calculated that saving every failing institution would drain resources needed to save the system as a whole. Sometimes you have to let one firm die to save the rest. But other institutions receive support. Morgan organized pools of money from healthy banks to support struggling ones. He convinced John D. Rockefeller to deposit $10 million into Union Trust. He persuaded the Treasury Secretary to deposit $25 million of government funds into New York banks. By the end of October, the immediate crisis had stabilized. But then came another shock. The New York Stock Exchange was on the verge of collapse. Brokers couldn't get loans to cover their positions. If the exchange closed, it would trigger a catastrophic loss of confidence. Morgan assembled brokers, bankers, and trust company presidents in his library on November 2nd. He told them they had until the market closed to raise $25 million to keep the exchange open. Then he locked the doors. For hours, the men argued, negotiated, and resisted. Morgan sat silently in a corner, playing solitaire and occasionally smoking cigars. Around midnight, he presented a document. He told the trust company presidents they would sign it and commit to the loan, or he would let the system collapse. They signed. The stock exchange stayed open. The worst of the panic was over. Morgan's intervention worked, but it revealed a dangerous truth. The stability of the American financial system depended on the decisions of one private citizen. Morgan was brilliant, experienced, and public-spirited. But what if he hadn't been? What if he'd been on vacation longer? What if he'd been less capable? What if he'd used the crisis to profit at the public's expense? The panic exposed the fragility of a system without a central bank. Between mid-October and November, the U.S. economy had teetered on the edge of collapse. Only Morgan's personal intervention had saved it. The government had been powerless. The Treasury had limited funds and no authority to act decisively. Congress wasn't in session. It was clear to almost everyone that relying on private financiers during crises was unsustainable. America needed an institution that could provide liquidity, stabilize markets, and act as a lender of last resort. It needed a central bank. But the political obstacles remained enormous. Populist opposition to concentrated financial power was still strong. Rural areas feared Eastern domination. Small banks opposed anything that might favor large institutions. Creating a central bank would require overcoming decades of suspicion and hostility. And that's where the secret meeting comes in. In November 1910, 3 years after the panic, 6 men boarded a private rail car in New Jersey. They were told to come separately, use only first names, and tell no one where they were going. One even brought a shotgun to make it look like a hunting trip. Their destination was Jekyll Island, an exclusive resort off the coast of Georgia. The club's members included J.P. Morgan, William Vanderbilt, and other American elites. It was the richest, most exclusive, most inaccessible club in the world. The 6 men were Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's private secretary. They represented the most powerful financial interests in America: Rockefeller, Morgan, the European banking establishment. If the public knew they were meeting to design a central bank, the plan would be dead on arrival. Populists would call it a Wall Street conspiracy. So they met in secret. And for over 20 years, they denied the meeting ever happened. For 9 days, the men worked around the clock. They debated who would own the central bank, whether it should be one institution or many, how it would conduct monetary policy, how to balance regional interests against national control, how to make it politically palatable to a skeptical public. The challenge was designing a system that functioned like a European central bank but didn't look like one. Americans hated the idea of a central bank controlled from Washington or New York, so the plan called for regional reserve banks spread across the country, each owned by member banks in that region. There would be a board in Washington to coordinate, but power would be decentralized. It was a compromise, and it was brilliant. The system would function as a unified central bank in practice, but its structure would disguise that reality. Warburg, who understood European central banking better than anyone, insisted on this approach. Aldrich initially wanted a straightforward central bank, but Warburg convinced him political realities required camouflage. By the end of the conference, they had a draft. It became known as the Aldrich Plan. Senator Aldrich introduced it to Congress in 1911, and it promptly failed. Democrats, suspicious of anything associated with the Republican Aldrich and Wall Street, rejected it. But the plan didn't die. It just changed names. When Democrats won the White House and Congress in 1912, the reformers regrouped. The Aldrich name was dropped. Virginia Congressman Carter Glass introduced a new bill, the Federal Reserve Act. Structurally, it was almost identical to the Jekyll Island Plan. Regional reserve banks, a coordinating board, decentralized power with central oversight. President Woodrow Wilson supported it. To win over populists like William Jennings Bryan, Wilson emphasized that the Federal Reserve would be government-controlled, not banker-controlled. The president would appoint the board. Federal Reserve notes would be government obligations. In December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed Congress overwhelmingly. On December 23, Wilson signed it into law. The Federal Reserve System went into operation in November 1914, and for the next 16 years the Jekyll Island meeting remained a secret. The participants denied it happened. When journalist B.C. Forbes wrote about it in 1917, most dismissed it as fiction. Only in 1930, when Aldrich's biography was published and Frank Vanderlip wrote his autobiography, did the truth emerge. The 6 men admitted they had met secretly on Jekyll Island. They admitted they had written the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. And they admitted they had hidden it because they knew the plan would fail if the public knew Wall Street bankers had designed it. The panic of 1907 and the creation of the Federal Reserve teach us something uncomfortable. Financial crises create political opportunity, and that opportunity is often used to centralize power in ways that would be impossible during normal times. Morgan saved the system in 1907, but his intervention proved that private individuals shouldn't have that kind of power. So the solution was to give that power to an institution instead. An institution designed by the same financial elites who had just demonstrated their control over the economy. The irony is obvious. The panic exposed the danger of concentrated financial power. The response was to create the most powerful financial institution in American history. Does that mean the Federal Reserve was a conspiracy? Not exactly. The men who created it genuinely believed a central bank was necessary. They had watched the panic unfold. They had seen the damage. They knew America needed a lender of last resort. But they also knew they couldn't be honest about who designed it. So they met in secret. They hid their involvement. And they created a structure that looked decentralized and democratic, but functioned as a central bank controlled by financial elites. More than a century later, the Federal Reserve remains controversial. It has survived the Great Depression, World War II, stagflation, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID pandemic. It has evolved far beyond what its founders envisioned. Its balance sheet has expanded into the trillions. Its interventions have grown more aggressive with each crisis. And the fundamental tension remains. The Fed is supposed to serve the public interest, but it's run by people drawn from and returning to the financial industry it regulates. It's supposed to be independent of politics, but its leaders are appointed by politicians. It's supposed to prevent crises, but its policies often enable the conditions that create them. The Panic of 1907 didn't create these contradictions. It revealed them. And the Federal Reserve didn't resolve them. It institutionalized them. In October 1907, J.P. Morgan locked bankers in his library until they saved the financial system. It worked, but it proved that America couldn't rely on private citizens to rescue the economy. 3 years later, 6 men met secretly on Jekyll Island and wrote the blueprint for a central bank. They denied it for decades because they knew honesty would doom the plan. In December 1913, Congress created the Federal Reserve. And ever since, Americans have argued about whether it serves the public or the banks, whether it prevents crises or causes them, whether it's a necessary stabilizer or a dangerous concentration of power. We chose the second risk, and we're still living with the consequences. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.